What I've got here is the brand new NVIDIA RTX 5090. Now this thing is a beast for AI workloads. It's got 22,000 CUDA cores, 5th generation tensor cores, and 32 gigs of VRAM. But if you're thinking of picking one up for your own AI workloads, let's say you want to run local LLMs, or you want to train your own models, you might be wondering if you need an equally beastly motherboard to keep up with the 5090. Because the 5090 supports PCIe Gen 5, but unless you've upgraded your motherboard in the last few years, you might only have PCIe Gen 4 or 3. So what I've set out to answer is how much does this really matter for AI workloads? I've been busy benchmarking the 5090 on 20 LLM tasks and 124 PyTorch training and inference tasks to answer exactly this question. And I'm going to be comparing PCIe Gen 5 with Gen 4, Gen 3, and even down to Gen 2 and Gen 1 to quantify exactly how much of a difference the PCIe generation makes for AI performance. Now this Testbench uses an AMD Ryzen 9 9950X with an ROG Strix X670E-E motherboard. This is paired with 192 gigs of Crucial Pro DDR5 RAM, a Samsung 990 Pro SSD, and the 5090 itself is the MSI Ventus 3X. Now this is exactly the same system. The only difference will be going into the BIOS, changing the link speed of that PCIe slot from automatic to 4, 3, 2, 1, and testing all of them in sequence. So let's kick it off with some LLM inference benchmarks. Now all of these use Llama with default settings, including context size. These were all evaluated on 6 total prompts, which are 3 prompts repeated twice, and every model is tested with the exact same set of 6 prompts. Now let's start with the smallest of Google's brand new Gemma 3 models, and this is the 1 billion version of it. And if you drop from Gen 5 to Gen 4, you lose 0.8% of performance. If you drop down to Gen 3, you lose 4.6%. Gen 2, that's 15.6%. And if you drop all the way down to Gen 1, which I don't think you will be doing if you've got a 5090, but I'll run these out of curiosity, and Gen 1 loses 37.5%. Now what happens as we gradually increase the size of these models? So now going to the same Gemma 3 architecture, but the 4 billion variant, Gen 4 loses slightly more at 1.2%. Gen 3 loses 6.9% of performance. Gen 2, 15.6, which is exactly the same as before. And Gen 1 loses 34.8% of performance. Let's increase again to 12 billion. Now, Gen 4 only loses 0.1% of performance, but Gen 3 loses 5.8%, Gen 2 loses 16.2%, and Gen 1 loses 37.2%. Let's move on to the biggest Gemma, and I think this is kind of interesting. So Gen 4 loses 0.7%, Gen 3 loses 5.8%, Gen 2 loses 11.2%, and Gen 1 loses 19.6%. And at first it might seem surprising that the bigger model needs PCIe Gen 5 less than the smaller ones, but actually this isn't surprising to me. The bigger model takes more GPU compute, and so the GPU is spending more of its time crunching these numbers and less time communicating with the CPU. So I think it makes sense that the bigger Gemmas are less PCIe link speed bound than the smaller ones. But let's see if the trend continues to other models. Next, let's have a look at DeepSeek, and I'm going to be going through every single distill from 1.5B to 70 billion parameters. Now, even 70 billion, as you're about to see, doesn't fit on the GPU, so it takes a big performance hit. And that's the reason I didn't go for the bigger models. You know, the 671 billion isn't going to come close to fitting on one of these cards. But interestingly, this small DeepSeek, which is 1.5 billion parameters, takes a much smaller performance hit. So even all the way from PCIe Gen 5 to Gen 1, it only loses 10.6 performance. If you're with a more realistic setup using Gen 3 or Gen 4, you either lose 1.4% or 0.7% respectively. If we look at a bigger DeepSeek, now 7 billion, we see a similar trend to Gemma, where the bigger models are less bound by bandwidth to the GPU. So 7 billion, dropping all the way to Gen 1, only loses 6.7%. Gen 3 is 1.4% slower. Gen 4 is actually 0.3% faster on average, but I think that's within margin of error. Now let's look at DeepSeek R1, 8 billion. Gen 1 is 5.8% slower. Gen 2 is 2.2% slower than Gen 5. All of these comparisons are to Gen 5. Gen 3 is exactly 1% slower. And Gen 4 is 0.1% faster. At 14 billion, Gen 1 is 4.4% slower. Gen 2 is 1.2% slower. Gen 3 is 0.7% slower. And Gen 4 is 0.1% slower. DeepSeek R1, 32 billion now. Gen 1 is only 2.3% slower than Gen 5. Gen 2 is only 1.2% slower. Gen 3 is only 0.7% slower. And Gen 4 is 0.1% slower, so almost identical speed. Now, DeepSeek 70 billion is the exact same architecture as Llama 70 billion. So I didn't want to run the same architecture twice. DeepSeek to benchmark was much slower because it's the same architecture, but it does the thinking ahead of time. So when we look at Llama, which we'll do next, Llama 70 billion will also give us an indication of DeepSeek 70 billion performance. But as we've done so far, let's start with the smallest Llama models. So this is Llama 3.2, 1 billion. From now on, I'm only going to tell you the percentage difference for Gen 3 and Gen 4, because I suspect the vast majority of you will be on one of those generations. So here, Gen 3 is 3.0% slower and Gen 4 is 0.8% slower. Now using a 3 billion parameter Llama, Gen 3 is 3.3% slower than Gen 5, and Gen 4 is 0.3% slower than Gen 5. 8 billion now, Gen 3 is 0.7% slower, Gen 4 was 0.5% faster. And let's have a look at Llama 3 70 billion. As I said, this gives us an indicator of how DeepSeek 70 billion distill will run. And this is weird. So the slower generations are faster than PCIe Gen 5. And if you look at the dots on top of the bars, those represent different experiments. So you can see that across running this 2 separate times, the same trend was noticed in both. So Gen 1, 3.7% faster than Gen 5, Gen 2, 3% faster, Gen 3, 2.6% faster, and Gen 4, 3.1% faster. Now, I have no idea why this is. I think it's related to the fact that the entire model doesn't quite fit on the GPU. So if we look at the raw numbers before, so at 8 billion, we're doing almost 200 tokens per second across the board. But when we increase the model size to 70 billion, this is now 3.5 tokens per second or so. And this is because the model doesn't fit, so at least some of it will have to go to the CPU. So I think we're seeing some effect of that. This doesn't reflect computation that's being done on the GPU really, or not as much as the other graphs. If you have a theory about why this is, that explains it better, so why there seems to be this inverse relationship to what we expect, then feel free to let us know down in the comments below. Let's have a look at Mistral's models now. And we start with Mistral 7 billion. Now this looks relatively flat. Gen 1 is 3.6% slower, Gen 2 2.9% slower, Gen 3 is 0.8% slower, but Gen 4 is 0.1% faster. At least Gen 3, 4, and 5 are within margin of error of each other. A very different picture for Mixtral, which is Mistral's very early, one of the first, if not the first, open source mixture of experts models. Now we see something different here. Gen 1 is 29.5% slower than Gen 5. Gen 2 is 15.5% slower than Gen 5. Gen 3 is still significantly slower, 6.9% slower, and Gen 4 is 0.8% slower. Now, if we look at the bigger Mistral, which is 8 by 22 billion models, we see a similar picture to Llama 70 billion, where we're certainly not bottlenecked by lower PCIe generations, and it even looks like some of them are faster than Gen 5. Again, I think this is an artifact due to a large part of the model not being on the GPU. And we can see that the tokens per second is much slower as a result. And so it's harder to draw conclusions. Now let's look at some other models. I've only looked at one variant of each of these, but I wanted to give as much variety to these tests as possible. So Falcon, 7 billion, Gen 1 is 4.6% slower, Gen 2 is 1.9% slower than Gen 5, Gen 3 is 1.4% slower, and Gen 4 is 0.1% slower. Phi, 14 billion. Gen 1 is 3.9% slower than Gen 5, Gen 2 is 2.6% slower than Gen 5, Gen 3 is 0.4% slower than Gen 5, and Gen 4 is 0.3% slower than Gen 5. So let's look at Qian's latest 32 billion parameter reasoning model, all within 1.5% of each other. So Gen 1 is 1.3% slower than Gen 5, Gen 2 is 1.1% slower, Gen 3 0.6% slower, and Gen 4 0.1% slower. Now 35 billion Command R, again very flat. So Gen 1 is 1.7% slower than Gen 5, Gen 2 1.0% slower, Gen 3 1.4% slower than Gen 5, and Gen 4 0.3% faster. Now, if we take an average of all 20 models, comparing generation by generation and comparing all 6 prompts for every single experiment, we get that Gen 1 is on average 10.7% slower than Gen 5, Gen 2 is 5.2% slower than Gen 5, Gen 3 2.2% slower than Gen 5, Gen 4 0.3% slower than Gen 5. Now this is just an overview of tokens per second inference performance of every single model in this test, and this is only at Gen 5. You can see that the very fastest inference is Llama 3.2 1 billion at 467 tokens per second. And you can see a very clear cutoff between the models that fit on GPU that were doing tens of tokens per second, and then the 2 models which had to offload some layers to the CPU, and those are Llama 3 70 billion and Mistral 8 by 22 billion, which are much lower than all the others. And here's an overview of the VRAM utilized by every model after all 3 prompts. And this is calculated by looking at the VRAM after all 3 prompts and subtracting the VRAM before starting inference. And that tells me how much GPU VRAM is allocated just to this model. You can see Llama 370 billion and the big Mistral 8 by 22 use almost the whole 32 gig, and they might not have been able to use more than this because of other processes running on the computer, maybe driving the display, or because Llama doesn't try to fill it up to the max. I think there's some margin of error where it'll only allocate something like 90% of RAM to these models before it starts offloading to the CPU. But I hope this is a little bit helpful if you're thinking of running some of these models on a 5090 or on other cards. Now next, let's have a look at 124 PyTorch benchmarks split across training as well as inference. Now the results that we're going to see in a little sec are very unexpected. And so after I ran this the first time, I made the benchmark much harder and more representative by making it longer, but I got the same results the second time. Now let's have a look at some of them. I'm not going to go through every single result verbally, but I will show a summary in a table later on. But I'm going to start with the training benchmarks, and I'm going to start with the architectures that had the biggest difference of PCIe generation. Now the benchmark where PCIe generation had the biggest impact is this DRQ, which is based on the paper, image augmentation is all you need. It applies heavy augmentation as regularization for deep reinforcement learning tasks. And Gen 1 here took 63.2% longer than Gen 5. Gen 2 took 17.1% longer than Gen 5. Gen 3 took 0.8% longer than Gen 5. And Gen 4 took 0.7% longer than Gen 5. And all of these y-axes are going to be average time taken per step. And so lower is faster and better. Now the next one is background matting, which does like this, but without the green screen, using AI instead. Gen 1 here is 10.8% slower than Gen 5. Gen 2, weirdly, is under 1% faster than Gen 5. Gen 3 is 4.3% faster than Gen 5. And Gen 4 is almost 7%. It's 6.9% faster than Gen 5. Next we have Big Bird. Now this is a transformer architecture by Google from about 4 years ago. And here Gen 1 is 10.3% slower than Gen 5. Gen 2, 1.6% slower than Gen 5. Gen 3 is 3% faster than Gen 5 exactly. And Gen 4, 0.6% faster than Gen 5. Now in the description, I'm going to link to the exact benchmark that I used here. It's literally PyTorch/benchmark. But there you can read more about the test and more about what these models are and which ones better apply to your workloads. Now next is this thing called TimRegNet. But again, we see a similar picture where Gen 1 is a lot faster than Gen 5. But if we look at Gen 3 and 4, they're looking on par or even slightly faster sometimes. Now let's look at the inference tasks that were most impacted by PCIe generation. And we start with a speech transformer where Gen 1 was 35.2% slower per step compared to Gen 5. Gen 2, 14.7% slower. Gen 3, 5.5% slower. And Gen 4, 1.1% slower. And next we have inference using T5, which is a transformer by Google. Here, Gen 1 is 24.6% slower. Gen 2, 1.9% slower. Gen 3, 1.8% faster. And Gen 4, 3.6% faster. Now, I'm not going to bore you by talking through every one of those. Here is a table that summarizes all 124 results. And here, this is how many percent longer the average step took. So 63.2% in the first row for Gen 1. That means Gen 1 was 63.2% slower than Gen 5. Gen 5 is 0% slower than Gen 5. And negative numbers, for example, in the second row, Gen 4, minus 6.9% there means that Gen 4 was actually 6.9% faster than Gen 5. And I'll just show each table for 5 seconds so you can look at what's most relevant for your workflow. Now let's look at the overall average. Now the average step overall was 11.6% slower using Gen 1 compared to Gen 5, 3.7% slower in Gen 2, 0.6% faster in Gen 3, and 2.0% faster in Gen 4. These are the results for training. So Gen 1, 21.2% slower than Gen 5, Gen 2, 0.9% faster, Gen 3, 2.8% faster, and Gen 4, 3.5% faster. And if we only look at inference now, not training, Gen 1 was 21.3% slower than Gen 5, Gen 2, 10.3% slower than Gen 5, Gen 3, 0.9% slower than Gen 5, and Gen 4 was 1.2% faster than Gen 5. Now let's talk a little bit about the strengths and limitations of these experiments. Strengths. I tried to give the broadest possible set of results that I could. So local LLMs are going to be one of the biggest uses for a 5090. Llama is very popular. I certainly use it. And in Llama, I wanted to give as many results as possible, and I've managed to give benchmarks on 20 different LLMs. Again, in PyTorch, I found this one official PyTorch benchmark that allows you to benchmark on dozens or even hundreds of different architectures if you would like to. I also kept the Testbench as identical as possible. It is the same Testbench, just with different link speeds set in the BIOS, and that removes one source of potential error. But one important limitation is that this PyTorch benchmark isn't explicitly designed to benchmark bandwidth-intensive tasks. The batch sizes are quite small, the models might not use up the whole card, and so any communication between the CPU and GPU isn't likely to be bottlenecked by the link speed. It's possible that other applications are much more bottlenecked by the link between the CPU and GPU. I suspect anyone working with 3D medical imaging is going to be more reliant on this link speed. I trained 3D medical imaging models, but I couldn't find a library that lets me run a huge number of benchmarks in medical imaging and other bandwidth intensive tasks. If you know of such a library that allows me to benchmark heavier duty models that are more reliant on this link speed, I'd be very grateful if you let me know down in the comments below. I also didn't get a chance to look at multi-GPU training. It's possible that, let's say you're running Llama with a very big model, but you have two cards. It can't offload to two of them. And since the 4090, NVIDIA have taken out the NVLink connectors between the cards. And so communication between cards, if you have two 5090s, I suspect that'll be much more bottlenecked by PCIe generation. So I think two 5090s would be a very interesting test in the future. I just don't have a second one at the moment. Perhaps if you leave very generous Patreon donations, I can make that upgrade and run that comparison, but it's out of my budget at the moment. But what do these results mean for most people? If you're thinking of picking up one of these 5090s because of the 32 gigs of VRAM, you want to play with local language models that are small enough to fit on one card, and you're using Llama, I'm very confident that you won't be bottlenecked by Gen 4 or Gen 3. If you're going to be training on this card, using the architectures in this benchmark and using similar settings, so batch sizes and resolutions and things, then I can also be relatively confident that you won't be bottlenecked by Gen 4 or Gen 3. But if you're doing anything else, so multi-GPU LLM inference using Llama or something else, or if you want to train with much bigger batches or training jobs that require higher bandwidth, I can't draw any conclusions about that at the moment. I would love to do a more in-depth comparison on that in the future. I hope you found this informative. If you liked it, I think you'll also like this video. I did an in-depth comparison in Blender to see whether your CPU is bottlenecking your GPU performance, and whether a 9950X is worth it as an upgrade for Blender rendering, even if you're rendering on your GPU.